The arena walls were carved from the bones of beasts long extinct, their ivory stained by the blood of centuries, and high above, the alien crowd thundered like a living storm, hungry for death, hungry for violence, hungry for tradition. The sky cracked with thunder that wasn't from clouds, but from the great war drums of the Thalrex Dominion. And beneath that crimson sky, in the pit of that Colosseum, stood a human with nothing but a rusted blade and eyes that did not blink. He was alone, no banners, no fanfare, just a nameless man dragged in chains from a shipwrecked freighter weeks ago. They called him Prisoner 017A, but the crowd had already given him a name, Fleshbait. A weakling offered to entertain them with his screams. The queen herself sat atop the golden throne, her 6 fingers wrapped around the armrest, her expression frozen like sculpted ice, her crown of live serpents hissing with boredom. Beside her stood her champion, the pride of Thalrex, a beast of a warrior named Vorak the Spine-Splitter, 10 feet tall, armored in obsidian scales, his twin blades humming with sonic charge. The gong roared across the arena like a blast wave, and the gates opened with a hiss, releasing Vorak with the elegance of a charging tank. Each step he took shattered the bone-tiled floor, and still the human didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even lift his blade. The crowd began to laugh. The queen's lips curled upward in disdain, and the announcer, a 3-eyed scribe drone, declared this to be the shortest trial of the blood rite in over 2 centuries. Vorak circled the human like a predator toying with a cornered animal, swinging his blades in wide arcs that hummed through the air. Sparks dancing from the edges, he taunted the human in the tongue of Thalrex, promising to break his bones in order from toes to skull. The human said nothing, just shifted his foot slightly, adjusting his weight. And when Vorak lunged forward, the human moved. It was not a movement of desperation, nor fear, nor even survival. It was practiced, deliberate. And inhumanly fast, he ducked beneath the sweeping blade, twisted past the second, and in one clean motion, his rusted sword flashed upward. A line of crimson erupted across Vorak's chest, and before anyone could understand what had happened, the champion fell to his knees, then collapsed sideways in 2 perfect halves. Silence devoured the arena. Like a beast of its own, the crowd froze in mid-roar. The queen's fingers clenched the throne so tightly the stone cracked, and the announcer drone short-circuited for a brief second before repeating in a broken voice, "Blood trial completed, challenger victorious." The AI judges, ancient floating cubes bound by forgotten pacts, descended from the high spires surrounding the arena, their mechanical voices layered and absolute, citing the code of honor trials passed down from the founding war, stating that any who defeats the queen's champion in blood combat is to be honored and rewarded with a royal bond, either a concubine of his choice, a noble title, or freedom under sacred law. The queen's mouth opened to speak, but not a sound came out. The human turned slowly, his blade dripping, his armor cracked but his gaze untouched, and looked directly at the queen, not with lust, not with vengeance, but something worse in the eyes of the Thalrex, calm defiance. She felt it pierce through her like an arrow of ice. She had seen thousands fight and die in that pit, but this one felt different. This one didn't kneel. This one didn't even care about the rules, and yet the rules had spoken for him. Whispers broke across the stands like wildfire. The Thalrex nobles leaned into one another, wondering if the queen would truly honor the code, whether she would offer herself or send one of her sacred maids, all bound by blood, to the throne. The judges turned to the human and asked for his choice, their glowing sigils casting blue light on his scarred face. And the human's voice finally cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "I want her," he said, and his finger pointed directly at Queen Cathari. Gasps rippled like shockwaves through the arena. Even the wind seemed to pause. Never before had a slave dared to choose the monarch herself. Never before had a champion's defeat turned into such an insult. The queen rose to her feet, her cloak of scaled feathers rippling with energy, her voice thundering across the pit as she demanded the judges nullify his claim. She argued it was dishonor, sabotage, a mockery of law, but the judges were unmoved. "Law is law," they said. "Sacred code is older than crowns." Her inner circle of advisors began whispering strategies, searching for loopholes, ways to delay, avoid, or counter the demand, but they found none. Ancient treaties signed in blood and bound to AI protocols had no exceptions. If she defied it, she would be branded an oathbreaker. Her bloodline considered illegitimate, her people would revolt, her throne would be dust. Still, she could not believe what had happened. Her strongest, her undefeated pride, carved in half by a human no one had even trained, and now she was expected to belong to him. Her mind boiled with a fury she could not show. She would not submit, not like this. She would find a way to undo this shame. And if law would not bend, then perhaps death could break it. The human was taken from the pit by guards who no longer mocked him. They kept their eyes low, unsure whether they were escorting a prisoner or a god in the making. He said nothing, walking with the same calm stride, as if nothing had happened, as if splitting a legend in half was a simple chore, as if taking a queen was not a challenge, but an afterthought. And far above, in the heart of the throne chamber, Queen Cathari stood alone, staring into the stained glass image of her bloodline's triumphs, and for the first time in her reign, she felt a shadow rise over her legacy, not from an army, not from a rebellion, but from a single human with no name, no title, and no fear. She whispered to herself, barely audible even to her own ears. This is not over, and the arena, still drenched in silence, waited for what came next, because everyone, even the stars above, sensed that something far greater had just begun. Queen Cathari stood motionless in her chamber carved from black stone and gold, her jaw tight, her fingers clenched around the edge of her throne as the ancient AI judges hovered just outside her platform, their cold voices echoing the same cursed line over and over again. The law has been invoked, the bond must be fulfilled. And though her guards stood tall around her, none dared speak, none dared meet her burning gaze, none dared remind her that the law was older than her dynasty. Across the citadel, the human was not in a cell, not in chains, not in pain. He was in the guest wing, being treated with quiet hands and cautious eyes. Alien servants dressed his wounds, cleaned the dried blood from his armor, and offered food they had never thought a human would taste in this lifetime. None of them spoke to him unless spoken to first. None questioned the silence in his eyes. None looked directly at the man who split their champion in half with a single stroke. The AI judges summoned a council that very night. Ancient protocol required all noble houses to bear witness. The court dome filled with whispers and tension. Holograms of lords from far systems flickered into place, all watching the scene with curiosity and hidden greed. Some hoped the queen would refuse and lose her throne. Others prayed she'd obey and humiliate herself. But none could deny what was written in the glowing text projected in the air above the dais. By blood trial, by sacred right, by conquest of strength, the victor shall be granted a royal bond from the line of those who rule. If the victor chooses the ruler herself, the law is final, irreversible, binding until death or full unity of oath. The queen rose slowly, her every movement precise, her long crimson robe trailing behind her like a river of fire. And she spoke not with anger, but with a voice sharpened by ice and control. The law is ancient, yes, but it was never meant for this. It was not written for an outsider, not for a human. The judges rotated calmly, their mechanical lenses locking on her with unfeeling clarity. The law does not see species, only strength. She turned her gaze to the crowd, to the noble houses, to the watching masses, and though she longed to declare the trial a farce, to call it invalid, she knew the price. If she rejected the bond, war would erupt within her own court. The warrior castes would claim she had dishonored the code. Her rivals would rise, her bloodline would be marked weak and worse. The judges themselves would sanction her rule as broken. In that moment, she hated the human more than she had ever hated anything. Not for killing Vorak, not for humiliating her people, but for trapping her with her own laws, for using her honor like a cage. And yet, when she finally turned to face him, when the guards brought him into the dome in silent formation, she felt a cold twist in her heart. He walked with no arrogance, no pride, his wounds still fresh, his expression unreadable, and when the judges asked him again to confirm his choice, he simply nodded once and spoke 3 words that cracked like lightning. I choose her. The words echoed through the dome like a death knell, and the nobles erupted in whispers. The queen's inner circle shifted nervously, and still she stood silent, because there was no escape. The eye judges glowed brighter and began the ceremonial process, declaring her bound to the victor, not as a servant, not as a slave, but as a partner under the code of ancient unity. Until the bond was broken by mutual decree or death, she was to fulfill the rites, to offer her name, her time, her presence, and her trust. And though it was symbolic more than physical, it was the greatest insult of all to one who had ruled unchallenged for over 2 centuries. She clenched her jaw and nodded, forcing the words through her teeth. I will obey the law. The human said nothing, not a smile, not a twitch of satisfaction, just a respectful bow of his head that infuriated her even more. She had expected a smirk, a cruel grin, some glimpse of victory, but he gave her none, and that made her rage burn deeper. She left the court without another word, her robes swirling behind her like smoke, her mind spinning with fury and calculation. Back in her private chambers, she smashed a crystal sculpture of her ancestors against the wall and turned to her most loyal maid, a tall warrior named Sra with a blade hidden in every sleeve, and spoke low and sharp. He will not live to see the next cycle. But even as her rage boiled, the AI judges moved swiftly, their drones already preparing the chambers for the binding ritual, a symbolic event where the queen would be forced to spend the coming cycle in the human's presence, sharing space, time, and counsel, offering decisions together, walking side by side, not as ruler and subject, but as equals. And that was something her people had never witnessed in the history of the Dominion. The announcement was made to the public by morning, and the city was divided. Some called it justice, others called it betrayal. The warrior clans were oddly silent, their eyes shifting with new respect toward the human. The slaves whispered that the age of Thalrex might be ending, and in the streets, graffiti of the queen beside the human began to appear, some mocking, some praising, all spreading like wildfire. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not breathe without thinking of the insult, the humiliation, the image of her champion broken in the sand, and the human standing untouched as if none of it mattered. And worse, he had taken nothing from her, no demands, no cruelty, only silence. and that silence made him dangerous in ways she could not measure. The ceremony would begin in 2 days, and in that time she prepared everything: hidden weapons, coded messages, backup plans, for she would not walk into that chamber alone. And if the law would bind her to a human, she would find a way to twist that law until it strangled him from within. But deep inside, buried beneath the fury and pride, was a single thread of fear she refused to name, because she had seen something in his eyes as he cut Vorak down. Something ancient, something terrible, something she thought only her people possessed, and now she feared that the human was not just a warrior. He was something far more dangerous, a symbol, and symbols do not die easily. The ceremonial chamber was carved from black obsidian and lit by the soft blue glow of ancient glyphs that floated above the floor like drifting spirits. The silence in the room was deep and dangerous, broken only by the low hum of the AI judges. As they hovered at the edges like silent witnesses to history, Queen Cathari stood near the center, her tall figure wrapped in ceremonial silk, her golden eyes sharp as daggers. And though the law demanded her presence, every breath she took was filled with poison and pride. She stared at the wide entrance, waiting for the human to walk in, not with fear, but with cold calculation, her fingers twitching slightly near. Her hip where a hidden blade was strapped beneath her robes. She had practiced the motion 100 times in her mind. One strike, clean and silent, but the law-bound guards would detect it. And the AI judges would execute her on the spot, so she waited, not with patience, but with fury caged by duty. The great doors opened with a hiss of steam, and the human stepped into the chamber, his clothes simple, his body still bruised from the fight, yet his walk was steady, his face unreadable. And most dangerous of all, his eyes met hers with calm defiance. He walked toward the center without hesitation, stopping just a few steps away from her, the space between them heavy with tension that no words could cut through. The AI judges initiated the binding protocol, their voices overlapping in a chorus of ancient law, declaring both parties as equals under the code of honor, their time together to begin immediately, their bond recognized until death or unity. And as the glyphs wrapped around them, forming glowing rings of light, the queen refused to look away, her jaw locked tight as stone. "You do not belong here," she said, her voice low and sharp like a blade in the dark. "You are an accident, a mistake the law was never meant to allow." The human said nothing at first, simply staring at the glowing ring of law between them, then lifting his gaze back to her as he finally replied, "I didn't come here to belong. I came here because I was dragged here. Now I'm staying because your law says I earned it." The queen's lips curled into a sneer, her voice rising as she stepped closer. "You think one lucky strike in the sand makes you worthy of standing beside me? You know nothing of our people, our history, our power. We have ruled for thousands of cycles, and you're just a creature from a forgotten rock." He didn't move, didn't flinch, just replied with steady eyes, "I don't care about your past. I care about what you do now. You're bound to me not because I wanted it, but because your own system gave it to me. You gave me power without asking, and now you don't like the result." Her hand twitched again near the blade, but she pulled it back slowly, rage boiling in her chest as the glyphs around them pulsed with a deeper blue. Binding the ceremony into law, the AI judges hovered closer, watching for any sign of rejection, any hint of refusal, and the nobles watching from behind the invisible walls held their breath, because this was the moment they had never expected to witness. Their queen forced to stand beside a human as an equal. She turned from him suddenly, her long braids swinging behind her like a whip, and walked to the far edge of the chamber, her voice sharp as lightning. "Very well, the bond is made. You may walk beside me. But do not mistake this for respect. You are still beneath me in every way. I will not kneel, not in ceremony, not in counsel, not in thought." The human followed her slowly, not chasing, not pushing, only moving with steady steps. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something new, something quiet but sharp. "I don't need you to kneel, I just need you to listen. Because the empire you think is eternal is already crumbling. And I'm the only one here who isn't lying about it." She turned back to him, fire flashing in her golden eyes. But the words stopped her for half a second longer than she wanted. She had heard the whispers in the halls, the silent doubt among the nobles, the shift in the war clans, and now she hated him even more for saying it aloud, hated the truth he carried. Like a sword she couldn't block. "You speak of things you don't understand," she growled, her voice trembling for the first time since the ceremony began. "You don't know what it takes to keep a galaxy under control, to keep trillions fed, loyal and afraid." Human stepped closer now, his tone calm, no louder than before. Then maybe the galaxy wasn't meant to be ruled by fear. The silence that followed cut deeper than any weapon, and even the eye judges dimmed their glow for a moment. As if sensing the shift in the balance, the queen stared at him, her pride a wall that refused to crack. But behind that wall something else stirred, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in centuries, doubt. She turned away again, this time slower, and walked toward the inner door that led to the shared quarters, a new formality demanded by the bond. Her voice cold and distant as she spoke without turning. "You may stay, but speak only when spoken to. Touch nothing, trust no one, and remember this." She paused at the door, her head tilted just enough for her voice to carry clearly. "This isn't your victory, human. This is just the beginning of your end." And then she vanished through the door, leaving the human alone with the fading glyphs and the hum of ancient machines. But he didn't follow right away, didn't move at all, just stood there with eyes that held no fear, only patience. Because he knew this wasn't about thrones or blood anymore. It was about breaking something far older than the queen herself. It was about changing everything she thought could never be changed. And somewhere deep in the foundation of the empire, a crack had begun to form. The moon above the citadel bled a soft purple light over the obsidian towers, and in the queen's private wing, hidden from the glowing halls and the prying eye judges, 3 shadows moved without sound. Her most trusted maids, warriors in secret. Loyal not to the law but to her alone, their names whispered only in times of war. Sra, the blade dancer, Linva the poison maker, and Rezi the ghost step. Each one bound to the queen since birth, each one raised not to serve, but to strike when the throne demanded it. They knelt before her now in the mirrored silence of her reflection chamber. Where even words were dangerous, the queen stood tall, her back to them, her voice quiet and sharp. "He cannot be allowed to survive," she said. And none of the 3 dared ask why. They already knew it wasn't because he was human, it wasn't because he defeated Vorak. It was because of something deeper, something worse, something they had seen in her eyes since the binding ceremony. Fear, not of death, not of the bond, but of change. Sra raised her head first, her eyes cold as steel. "How do you wish him removed, your majesty?" she asked. And the queen turned slowly, her expression unreadable, the light of the glyphs flickering across her face. "I want it quiet, I want it clean, and I want it soon. Before he speaks to more nobles, before he earns more eyes, before my people forget who wears the crown." Linva smiled faintly, her fingers already dancing over a vial tucked in her sleeve. He eats with us now. We can slip something into his drink. Fast, silent. Blamed on a poor digestion reaction. No, the queen said sharply. Her tone slicing the air like a whip. Too easy to trace. The judges watch everything inside the palace walls. Even what enters his blood. Rezi, the smallest of the three, moved without a sound. Her voice barely louder than a whisper. Then let it be in the quiet hours, when the lights dim, when the guards look away, when he sleeps. The queen nodded once, slowly like a judge passing. Sentence. Do it tonight, she said. And if you fail. She didn't finish the sentence, because she didn't have to. The three maids bowed and vanished into the dark corridors like smoke slipping through stone, and as the queen stood, alone, her eyes fixed on the distant towers beyond her chamber walls, she whispered to herself, "No man, no law, no bond will tame me." Meanwhile, in the guest quarters, the human sat in silence, his back against the polished wall, his eyes half closed, yet his mind fully awake. He had not slept properly in days, not because of the luxury bed, not because of fear, but because he knew what silence meant in a palace like this. He had been a soldier once, before the crash, before the arena, and the feeling of being watched never truly left his bones. The food they brought him sat untouched. The walls looked smooth, but he knew they were listening. The lights were soft. But he saw the flicker in the corner that betrayed hidden lenses. He waited in the shadows of his own room, his blade hidden beneath the bed, his instincts sharpened by war and betrayal. And when the air suddenly felt colder, he knew they were coming. Rezi was the first to slip through the ventilation shaft, silent as a thought. Her skin cloaked in dark cloth that shimmered with stealth tech. She dropped to the floor without a sound, her dagger already drawn. Linva followed from the hallway, pretending to bring fresh towels, but beneath the fabric she hid a needle. Filled with a clear, heart-stopping toxin, Shra took position outside the chamber, ready to strike if he ran, their movements timed with perfect precision. A web of death spun tight and flawless. But when Rezi crept toward the bed, the shape beneath the blanket didn't breathe. She paused, and then she knew, too late. The blanket exploded upward, thrown into her face, and the human struck from the side, faster than she believed possible. His fist connected with her throat, and she dropped like a sack of bone and cloth. Before Linva could even react, he rolled across the floor, kicked her feet out from under her, and caught the needle mid-air as she fell, twisting her wrist until she screamed in pain. Shra burst through the door, her twin daggers flashing. But the human didn't retreat. He stepped forward into her space, parried the first blade with his arm guard, and brought his elbow down hard against her collarbone. Her cry filled the chamber as she dropped one dagger, but she didn't yield. She spun low and sliced across his leg, the cut shallow but precise. He winced, blood warm against his boot, but he didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't back away. He grabbed the curtain rope and swung it around her wrist, twisting and locking, her arm behind her back. He brought her to the ground, his breath sharp, his eyes blazing not with anger, but with disappointment. Rezi coughed on the floor, Linva trembled beneath his knee, and Shra cursed through clenched teeth as the rope tightened. "I don't want to kill any of you," he said, his voice low and steady. "But if you try this again, I won't give you a second chance." Shra spat toward him. "You dishonor her by breathing." He looked down at her, the pain in his leg ignored. "No, your law dishonored her. I just followed it better then." "Your champion." The chamber door opened. Guards rushed in, drawn by the noise, and stopped dead at the sight before them. Three of the queen's most dangerous shadows bound, beaten, and alive. The human turned to them calmly and spoke with quiet authority. "Take them back to her. Tell her I know she sent them. And tell her if she wants me dead, she can try herself." Next time, the guards hesitated, but obeyed, dragging the 3 stunned maids away in silence. And as the door closed, the human finally exhaled, sitting back against the wall, wiping the blood from his leg with a torn sheet, and whispering to himself, "So much for peace." In the throne chamber, Queen Cathari stood when her guards returned, her eyes scanning the bruises on her maids, the shame etched into their silence. And when she heard the human's message, she said nothing for a long time, her fingers slowly curling around the arm of her throne, her expression unreadable, but deep inside, something strange twisted in her chest. Not just rage, not just pride, but confusion, because he had the chance to kill them, and he didn't. The queen sat alone in her war chamber, surrounded by ancient maps etched into glowing stone, her hands locked behind her back, her gaze burning into the cold flames of the wall torches. The echo of failure still rang in her ears. Her maids had returned broken and defeated, and though she had said nothing to them, her silence was a punishment far crueler than any blade. They had trained for cycles in the shadow halls of the Obsidian Citadel. They had slain kings in the dark, infiltrated fortresses without a sound, yet a single human had crushed them with bare hands and calm resolve. It wasn't just a defeat, it was humiliation, and worse. He had shown mercy, mercy that confused her, enraged her, gnawed at her bones like fire trapped beneath skin. Her advisors offered no solutions, no strategies. They feared the AI judges who still hovered through the palace halls, watching, listening, enforcing the law of the binding. And every time the queen passed their glowing forms, she felt like a chained beast in a glass cage, unable to lash out, unable to breathe. The human, meanwhile, did not seek vengeance. He did not send messages, did not gloat, did not even demand an audience with her. He remained in his quarters, tending to his wounds, reading the digital scrolls provided to him, walking the gardens only during dusk when the nobles watched him from the shadows with silent awe and curiosity. Some saw him as a threat, others as a prophecy, but all of them felt the same shift in the air. The queen knew she had lost control of the narrative, and if she couldn't destroy him through law or assassination, she had only one option left. She would face him directly, in private, with words sharpened by power, and if that failed, she would find a crack in his will and exploit it like a blade sliding between ribs. She summoned him the next night. Her voice passed through the AI channels, direct and unfiltered. No ceremony, no guards, just a command. Meet me in the Chamber of Echoes. And he came, as she knew he would, walking through the spiraling halls alone, without fear, dressed not in armor but in a simple cloak that revealed the scar across his collarbone from the arena, a reminder of the fight that started it all. The Chamber of Echoes was silent, but alive, the walls lined with metal that captured sound and threw it back in whispers. No lie could hide in this place. No voice could be raised in anger without returning. Sharper than before, it was a room used for truth, for oaths, and for betrayals. The queen stood at the far end, her back to him, her eyes locked on the flickering glyphs of her ancestors that danced above the floor. "You fight like a monster," she said, her voice steady, "but you act like a man." The human did not answer right away, his boots stopping just behind her, the space between them thin as breath. "You tried to kill me," he said. "3 of your finest in my room while I slept." She turned slowly, her golden eyes unblinking. "And you let them live, because I didn't come here To kill queens, he replied, his tone firm. I came here because your laws dragged me into your world. Now I'm standing inside your power, and all I want is to survive without playing the same game you play. The queen stepped closer, her gaze sharp as ever, but something beneath. It shifted, not weakness, not regret, but something harder to name. You humiliated me, she whispered. In the arena, in the court, and in my own chamber. You did that to yourself, he replied. You built a world that worships strength, and I just showed them strength they didn't expect. The chamber echoed those words, sending them back in layered whispers. Strength they didn't expect, strength they didn't expect, strength they didn't expect. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing deep, remembering the first time she held a blade, the first time she drew blood, the first time she stood before the council as queen, unchallenged, unbent, until now. I should have ended you the moment you fell into our hands, she muttered, more to herself than to him. I should have burned your name from our records, fed you to the beasts, and silenced your existence. But you didn't, the human said, his voice calm. And now we're here. A long silence followed, broken only by the hum of ancient machines and the soft rhythm of breath. Then the queen moved again, not toward him, but past him, walking toward the center of the chamber where a pool of memory water reflected the ceiling like a broken mirror. She stared down at it, her reflection flickering between her past and present self. Warrior and ruler, victor and captive. Why? Didn't you kill them? She asked suddenly. My maids. They would have ended you without hesitation. Why spare them? He looked at her carefully, his tone unwavering. Because if I become the thing I'm fighting, I've already lost. Her eyes narrowed. Then you're weak. No, he said, stepping beside her now, his reflection beside hers. It means I remember who I am, even when no one else does. The chamber didn't echo that line, it swallowed it, and for the first time, Queen Cathari felt something she hadn't felt since her coronation. A chill down her spine that didn't come from fear, but from uncertainty. She turned away sharply, her voice sharp again. This changes nothing. It changes everything, he said. You just haven't accepted it yet. The door opened behind him as if summoned by fate, and he walked through it without another word, leaving her alone with the whispers of her past and the weight of a future she no longer controlled. She didn't move for a long time, just stood, staring into the pool, the reflection of her crown flickering like dying fire. And in the silence that followed, the chamber echoed one word from the depths: change. The great hall was quiet, too quiet for a palace that ruled over 12 systems. The queen sat alone on the throne, her shoulders square but her eyes distant. The AI judges floated silently above her, watching but never speaking. They had fulfilled their duty, they had upheld the law, but now they merely observed, as if waiting for something even they could not predict. Queen Cathari stared at the wide doors across from her. Behind those doors walked the man who had shattered her legacy. With one blade, the man who had not claimed her out of lust or greed, but by law and fate. The man who refused to kneel but never demanded she kneel either. And somehow that made his presence harder to ignore, harder to hate, harder to destroy. For 3 cycles she had shared space with him, eaten in the same chambers, attended briefings. With him by her side, sat in silence beside him while her nobles whispered and her generals stared. And still he had made no demands, issued no commands, touched no crown. He had simply listened, walked, existed. And that quiet presence had begun to spread through her court like an infection. She had seen the way her commanders looked at him now. Not with contempt, but with curiosity. She had heard her youngest maid whisper to another that he looked like the statues in the old temples, made of fire and sorrow. She had read the petition sent by border lords who suddenly wished to meet this human who had claimed the queen and lived, not as a pet, not as a prisoner, but as something else entirely, and it terrified her, because something deep inside her had begun to shift. It wasn't love, no, not yet, perhaps never, but it was no longer pure hatred either. She had started to measure her own words in his presence, to wonder how he would see her choices, to question her own reasons before speaking them aloud. And that self-doubt was a crack in her power more dangerous than any sword. She rose from the throne, walked down the marble steps alone, and made her way to the Chamber of Roots, a room hidden beneath the palace where no light touched the walls. Only truth. It was here that her ancestors had come when they lost their way. It was here that rulers came not to be seen but to see themselves. And when the door closed behind her, silence swallowed her whole. She stood before the black glass wall, where reflection showed not just the body but the soul, and in the flickering shadow she saw herself not as the queen, but as the woman beneath the crown. Tired, frayed, trembling, she reached up and touched her chest where the ceremonial binding mark still burned faintly beneath her skin. And for a moment she let herself feel everything she had buried. The shame of defeat, the weight of legacy, the confusion of being seen not as a goddess, but as a person, and the terrifying pull of change. She fell to her knees, not in surrender, not in weakness, but in release. Her hands touched the cold floor as her breath shook in her chest. And for the first time in centuries, she whispered into the dark, not as a ruler, but as a soul lost in a world she no longer controlled. What am I if I am not feared? The room gave no answer, only the silence of a question that had no easy truth. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time moved differently in the Chamber of Roots, and when she finally stood again, something in her had settled, not peace, not clarity, but a calm acceptance of the storm that had already begun. She walked back through the quiet corridors without guards, without servants, her feet steady, her eyes clear. And when she arrived at the guest quarters, where the human rested, she did not announce herself. He was standing by the open balcony. The stars of her empire stretched wide before them, his hands resting on the edge, and he turned only slightly when she entered. Not surprised, not startled, just aware, she stepped beside him without speaking, the wind tugging lightly at the ends of her robe, and they both stood there in silence, the galaxy swirling above and below, until she finally spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. You could have left after the arena. You could have taken the title and gone. Why did you stay? He didn't answer right away. Just breaths slowly, his words arriving like falling ash, quiet and heavy. Because leaving would have meant it didn't matter, that everything I fought for was just survival. But I came to show that even in a place built on power, strength can look different. She nodded slowly, the stars reflected in her eyes. And now you've changed it. Not yet, he said, but maybe I've cracked it. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a threat, not as a trophy, but as a man forged by pain, tempered by mercy, and shaped by choice. And in that moment, something inside her shifted again, not completely, not forever, but enough to say the next words, then teach me. He turned to her fully now, the same calm in his eyes that had never left. Only if you're ready to listen. She held his gaze, no crown on her head, no guards at her back, only her truth and her will. I am, the AI judges, still silent, still unseen, recorded the moment in the vaults of history. marking it not as a command, not as a battle, but as the first equal step taken between two worlds that had only ever known control and defiance. And in that quiet night, beneath the stars of a crumbling empire, Queen Cathari stood not as a ruler bound by law, but as a leader willing to learn, and beside her stood the human who refused to conquer, yet conquered everything anyway. The sky over the Thelrex capital was darker than it had ever been. Thick clouds of red and black twisted above the towers, as if the heavens themselves watched in silence. The great plaza beneath the palace overflowed with aliens from every caste. Every house, every bloodline, all of them drawn by the same impossible truth. The queen had summoned them without guards, without force, without her usual voice of command. And they came not because they were ordered, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. At the heart of the palace, beneath the throne, where blood had sealed every ruler before her, Queen Cathari stood before the golden gate of her ancestors, her robes replaced by a simpler garment of dark silver. Her crown held in her hands, not on her head, her face calm but sharp. Beside her stood the human, still marked with the scars of battle, still silent as ever, and though he wore no armor, no jewels, and no cloak of power, the weight of his presence filled the chamber like thunder that had yet to crash. The AI judges floated in perfect orbit, their lights pulsing slowly as they scanned every signal, every gesture, every heartbeat in the room. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, had passed judgment on kings and traitors alike, and now they watched a queen and her bonded equal, about to do what no one in 10,000 years had dared. The nobles sat in rising tiers above the throne circle, their voices quiet, their eyes fixed. Many whispered in doubt, others in disbelief, a few in fear, but none spoke openly. None challenged the moment, because the queen had not told them what this gathering was for, and that unknown hung heavier than any law they had ever obeyed. Queen stepped forward and raised the crown high above her head, her voice carrying through the hall like a storm held back by will alone. For centuries we have ruled by strength, by tradition, by the will of the ancients and the terror of our blades. She paused, letting those words echo through the bones of the room. But strength alone has turned to stone, tradition to chains, and fear to silence. She lowered the crown slowly, her fingers tight around its base, her voice deeper now. We created a law so sacred that we thought no one would ever use it against us, and yet he did. She turned to the human now, not with rage, not with shame, but with something few had ever seen from her, respect. He did not win by politics, or power, or poison. He won by blade, by law, and by honor. The eye judges glowed brighter, confirming her words through code and memory, binding truth to history. I hated him, she said, the hall frozen by her confession. Not because he was weak, but because he showed me I was. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one dared interrupt. The queen turned and knelt before the golden gate, placing the crown at its base, a ritual of surrender never seen in their lifetime. Then she stood again, her back straight, her voice unwavering. The throne is no longer mine alone. She turned toward the human, her eyes steady. From this moment forward, the throne belongs to us both. A silence deeper than death fell across the hall. Nobles leaned forward. In disbelief, guards tightened their grips, and the AI judges whirred as their systems processed what had never been spoken before. I give him my name, she said. I give him my voice, my seat, my right to rule. The human did not move for a long moment, and then he stepped forward, not toward the throne, but beside her, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the fear like a blade through shadow. I didn't come to take your crown, he said. I came to stop a cycle. He looked out over the nobles, over the crowd gathered beyond the walls, and his voice grew stronger, not louder, just heavier. You've built a world where fear is strength, where silence is peace, where blood is power. But I've seen what that becomes. He placed his hand over the mark on his chest, the mark of the binding, the law that had pulled him into this world and forced it to see him. I'm not here to destroy what you are, he said. I'm here to build what you could be. Some of the nobles rose in protest, others shouted blasphemy. But the queen raised one hand and they fell silent again, not because of command, but because of awe. From this day, she said, the throne shall be ruled not by fear, but by balance, by war and peace, by blade and voice, by her blood and his fire. The AI judges confirmed the declaration, their glyphs sealing the pact in law. In time and in memory, outside the palace, the massive screens lit up with the queen's image beside the human, her voice carrying through every system. He is not our conqueror. He is not our prisoner. He is our king. The plaza erupted in confusion, in debate, in panic. But beneath that chaos was something new. Hope. Back inside the chamber, the nobles began to kneel, one by one, not all, not at once, but enough to show that the shift had begun, that the old world had cracked, and something new was rising through the fracture. Queen Cathari turned to the human once more, her voice quiet enough only he could hear. You didn't ask for this. And yet you carry it better than any who came before. The human looked into her eyes, his voice steady as stone. Because I remember what it's like to have nothing. She nodded once, and together they walked to the throne, not as ruler, and bonded, not as conqueror and captive, but as equals, as rulers of a new age. And as they sat, side by side, the chamber doors opened. The empire watched, and history changed forever.